Master Chief Jonas Graves took one look at the 17-year-old girl stepping off the transport, and before she could even say her name, he spat on the ground in front of her boots. "Somebody in Washington thinks this is funny," he said loud enough for every man on the tarmac to hear. "They sent me a child to babysit, a little girl who's gonna cry herself home in 3 days." He turned his back on her, didn't shake her hand, didn't ask her name. He'd already decided who she was. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If you believe that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most dangerous, hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end. And do me a favor, leave a comment and tell me what city you're watching from right now, because I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Let me know you're here. Now let's begin. The desert did not care who you were. It did not care about your rank, your reputation, or the 20 years you'd spent earning the respect of men who'd bled beside you. The Nevada sun came up the same way over everyone, and by 6 in the morning it was already climbing toward 104 degrees, pressing down on the training base like a hand trying to smother something. Aravance Vance stood at attention while Master Chief Graves circled her, the way a man circles something he's already planning to throw away. She was small. There was no arguing with that. 5'5", maybe 120 pounds, soaking wet with dark hair, pulled back so tight it looked painful, and eyes that didn't blink nearly as often as they should have. She wore the standard issue gear that had clearly been sized for someone larger, and it hung on her frame like a costume. "You know why you're here?" Graves asked. "Yes, Master Chief." "No, you don't." He stopped in front of her. "You think you're here because you're special, because some general read a file and got excited. But I've been doing this for a long time, and I've seen 100 people just like you. People who look good on paper, people who test well in a nice air-conditioned room in Virginia, and then they get out here and the desert eats them alive." He leaned in close. "You're going to quit. The only question is whether it's day 2 or day 3. Aravance said nothing. That silence irritated him more than any answer could have. He was used to 2 reactions from new recruits: fear or defiance. Either one he could work with. Either one told him something. But this girl just looked at him, calm as still water, and it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up in a way he refused to examine. "You got nothing to say," he pressed. "You didn't ask a question, Master Chief." A few of the men standing behind him made sounds they tried to disguise as coughs. Graves felt his jaw tighten. "Petty Officer Callahan," he barked without turning around. "Get her to the barracks. Introduce her to the schedule. And don't go easy on her just because command's got some experiment they want to run. When she washes out, and she will, I want it on record that we treated her exactly like everybody else." Callahan stepped forward. He was maybe 30 broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been sunburned and re-sunburned so many times it had gone permanently red. He looked at Aravance the way you'd look at a delivery that showed up at the wrong address. "Follow me," he said. She fell into step behind him, and the tarmac emptied. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that Aravance had already started working. From the moment the transport door opened, she'd begun counting. She counted the men. She counted their steps, the way they favored certain legs, the way one of them, the big one they called Kowalski, kept rolling his right shoulder like an old injury that never fully healed. She noted that Graves spoke to the group, but always positioned himself so his back was never to the desert. Old habit, old fear. She filed it away. Her father had taught her that. A long time ago, before everything changed, he used to sit with her on the porch of their house in the high country and quiz her. "Tell me 3 things about the man who just walked past," he'd say. And if she couldn't, they'd sit there until she learned to see. She could see now. She saw everything. Callahan led her into the barracks, a low building that trapped heat like an oven, and pointed at a bunk in the corner. "That's yours. Chow's at 1100. PT starts at 0500 tomorrow. And I mean starts, not shows up. You're late, you run extra. You slow, you run extra. You cry, you run extra." He paused. "You gonna cry?" "I don't know yet," she said. "I haven't been given a reason to." He studied her for a second, and something flickered across his face. Not respect, not yet, but something adjacent to curiosity. "The Master Chief, doesn't want you here," Callahan said, lowering his voice slightly, as if he were doing her a favor by being honest. "None of us do. This isn't personal. It's just the way it is. This program isn't built for someone like you. It'll break most grown men. You understand what I'm telling you. You're telling me you expect me to fail. I'm telling you it'd be easier for everybody if you just did it quietly and went home. Aravan set her small bag on the bunk. Petty Officer Callahan, she said, can I ask you something? What? When you were 17, did anyone tell you that you'd be here one day leading a SEAL evaluation unit in the Nevada desert? He frowned. No. So you didn't know what you were capable of at my age, but you're sure you know what I'm capable of. She sat down on the bunk. I'm not trying to be difficult. I just noticed the contradiction. Callahan opened his mouth, closed it, then walked out without another word. And as the door swung shut behind him, he found that he was against every instinct he had thinking about what she'd said. That evening in the small office at the end of the compound, Master Chief Graves sat across from a man named Reyes, his second in command. Reyes was leaner than the others, quieter with the kind of watchful stillness that made people nervous. He'd read the file, all of it, and what he'd read didn't match the girl he'd seen on the tarmac. You look at her scores, Reyes asked. I looked at enough. That's not what I asked Jonas. Graves rubbed his eyes. I don't need to look at scores. I've been reading people for 22 years. I read her in about 4 seconds. She's a liability. And when a liability gets out here in the field, people die. Real people. So no, I'm not going to coddle her because some office in D.C. wants to prove a point about who can and can't do this job. The point they want to prove, Reyes said slowly, is that they found someone unusual. Not that anyone can do it. Someone specific. He slid a folder across the desk. Her cognitive testing is off every chart we have. Spatial reasoning, threat assessment, memory recall under stress. She scored higher than anyone who's ever come through this program. Anyone, Jonas, including you. Graves didn't touch the folder. Tests aren't the desert. No, Reyes agreed. They're not. But I'd think real hard before you decide she's a joke. Because if she's not, and you spend the next 2 weeks treating her like one that's going to be on you when the review board asks how the evaluation went. For a long moment, Graves said nothing. Then he pushed the folder back across the desk without opening it. 0500, he said. We'll see what the desert says. The desert's never lied to me yet. At 4:45 the next morning, Aravance was already awake. She hadn't slept much, but not from nerves. She'd spent the night mapping the compound in her mind, memorizing the layout she'd glimpsed on the walk and timing the rotation of the perimeter lights. It was an old comfort, this kind of preparation. When you knew where everything was, the world felt less likely to hurt you. She was dressed and standing outside before any of the men emerged. When Graves came out and found her already waiting in the pre-dawn dark, standing at ease with her weighted pack already on her shoulders, he stopped short. You lost, he asked. No, Master Chief. PT's at 0500. Yes, Master Chief, it's 4:52. I didn't want to be late. Behind him, Kowalski snorted. Kid's eager. Give her a day. The other men filtered out, forming up in a loose line. There were 6 of them now, including Graves and Reyes. Callahan, Reyes, Kowalski, a young one named Torres, who kept looking at Aravance like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve, and a heavy-set veteran named Doyle who didn't look at her at all. Graves clapped his hands once. 3 miles, full weight. It's already 91 degrees and it's climbing. Anybody falls out, they run it again tomorrow with extra. Vance, he turned to her. You fall out, you're done. No second chance. You go home. That's the deal for you. You understand? The unfairness of it hung in the air. Everyone heard it. The men got second chances. She didn't. Reyes shifted his weight but said nothing. I understand, Master Chief, Aravance said. Good, then let's find out what you're made of. Graves smiled without any warmth in it. Move. They moved. The first mile was where the desert began its interrogation. The pack pulled at Aravance's shoulders 45 pounds of dead weight that turned every step into a negotiation. The heat came up off the ground and down from the sky at the same time, so there was nowhere to hide from it. The men set a punishing pace, and she understood immediately that it was deliberate. They weren't running their normal speed. They were running the speed that would break her. Kowalski dropped back to run beside her, grinning. How you feeling, kid legs? Okay, you look a little pale. She didn't answer. She'd already made a decision, one she'd made a long time ago about a lot of things. She would not spend energy on words she didn't need. Every breath had a job, and its job was not to reassure a man who wanted her to fail. Silent treatment, huh? Kowalski laughed. That's fine. You'll be screaming for a medevac by mile 2. But she wasn't. She matched the pace. Not easily. Her lungs burned and her thighs screamed, and there was a stitch in her side like a knife, but she matched it step for step because her father had taught her something else too. He'd taught her that pain was information, not instruction. It told you what was happening. It did not tell you what to do. What you did was your decision and no one else's. By mile 2, Kowalski had stopped talking. Not because he'd given up on her, but because he needed the breath himself. The pace was hurting him now too. He'd set a trap and walked into it alongside her. Up front, Reyes glanced back. He'd been keeping half an eye on the girl, expecting to see her fading. Instead, he saw her running with a strange economy of motion. No wasted movement, no bouncing, no flailing. She ran like someone conserving fuel for a journey she'd already calculated the length of. It was, he thought, unnerving. At mile 2.5, Doyle, the heavy-set veteran, began to falter. His breathing had gone ragged and he was drifting off the pace. Graves noticed and dropped back. Doyle, you good? Fine, Master Chief, Doyle gasped, which was obviously a lie. And here was the thing Aravance noticed, the thing she filed away with all the others. When Doyle struggled, Graves slowed the whole unit slightly to keep him with the group. A small mercy, a leader protecting his own. But it was a mercy that had a shape to it, a logic, and she understood the logic instantly. Graves would bend the rules for the men he'd decided belonged. He would not bend them for her. The rules weren't rules at all. They were a door, and he was the one deciding who got to walk through it. She said nothing. She just ran. The finish line was a battered wooden post at the edge of the training field, and as they came into the final quarter mile, the pace picked up. This was the part where men proved themselves, were the fastest, pulled ahead and staked their claim. Torres surged, Callahan surged, and then, to the genuine shock of every man watching, so did the girl. She didn't win. She wasn't going to win, not against grown men with years of conditioning, but she crossed the line seconds behind the fastest of them. Chest-heaving legs, shaking still on her feet, and she did not fall out. She did not stop. She ran through the post the way you're supposed to, and only then did she bend over, hands on her knees, dragging air into her ruined lungs. There was a silence on the field. Kowalski, who'd finished behind her, came stumbling in a good 20 seconds later, and the humiliation of that was written all over his sunburned face. Graves walked over to her. He'd expected to be delivering a speech right about now, a speech about how she'd given it a good try, but the desert had spoken. He didn't have that speech anymore. He stood over her and watched her breathe and felt something cold move through his chest. That's one run, he said finally. One, don't get comfortable. Aravance straightened up. Her face was flushed and streaked with sweat, but her eyes were exactly as calm as they'd been on the tarmac. I'm not comfortable, Master Chief, she said. I've never once been comfortable. That's not what I'm here for. She walked past him to get water, and Graves stood there for a moment longer than he should have, watching her go. Reyes appeared at his shoulder. You want to tell me again about the desert never lying, he said quietly. Shut up, Reyes. But there was no heat in it, and that more than anything told Reyes that a crack had appeared in something that had been solid for a very long time. The rest of that first week was a systematic attempt to find the girl's breaking point. Graves designed it that way. He told himself it was fair, that he was simply applying pressure the way pressure would be applied in the field, but a quieter voice in the back of his mind knew he was hunting for the moment she'd fail so he could finally be right about her. They ran weapons drills under fatigue, disassembling and reassembling rifles until their hands cramped, then doing it again with their eyes closed, then doing it again after 20 push-ups, so their arms shook too hard to hold the parts steady. Aravance's hands never shook. Or if they did, she'd learned to work with the shaking to time her movements to the tremor instead of fighting it. Torres, watching her fingers move over the disassembled weapon, muttered, "How's she doing that?" and got no answer because no one knew. They did heat marches under full load 4 miles across open ground with the sun at its worst, and on the third day one of the men went down. It wasn't Aravance. It was Doyle, whose body simply refused to continue and who had to be dragged into the shade and cooled with wet towels while the corpsman monitored him. Aravance kept marching. When the march ended, she was still standing, and Doyle from the shade watched her with an expression that had started grudgingly to change. But it was the psychological pressure conditioning that Graves believed would finally do it. This was where they took a person and stripped away the comfort of routine, kept them awake, gave them contradictory orders, made them fail at impossible tasks on purpose, and watched to see whether the mind held or shattered. It broke strong men. It had broken men Graves respected. He was certain it would break a 17-year-old girl. They kept her up for 30 hours. They gave her a knot to tie that could not be tied correctly and screamed at her when she failed, then screamed at her differently when she asked for clarification, then screamed at her for asking at all. They isolated her from the group, then punished the group for her mistakes so the men would resent her, then watch to see whether she'd crack under the weight of being hated. And Aravon simply endured it, not with defiance, not with tears, with a kind of quiet, watchful patience that Graves found more disturbing than any breakdown. She absorbed the chaos the way the desert absorbed the rain, without changing, without complaint, letting it pass through her and out the other side. On the second night of it, exhausted and irritated, and though he would not admit it, unsettled, Graves pulled her aside. "Why won't you break?" he asked. The question came out before he could stop it. It wasn't a taunt, it was almost a plea. Aravance looked at him with those steady eyes. "Do you want me to break, Master Chief? I want to understand what you are. Every person I've ever put through this has a bottom, a place where the real them comes out. Fear or rage or despair. And I always find it, but you I keep pushing, and there's nothing there. It's like pushing on a wall." She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd heard it. "I found my bottom a long time ago," she said, "before I ever came here. And there's nothing you can do in this desert that's worse than what I've already lived through. So you can keep pushing, but you're not going to find the place you're looking for. It's already been found, and I'm still here. Graves stared at her. He wanted to ask what she meant. He wanted to know what a 17-year-old could possibly have survived that made a SEAL evaluation feel like a mild inconvenience. But she'd already turned away, already gone still again, and the moment closed like a door. He walked back to his office and sat in the dark for a long time. And for the first time since the transport door had opened, Master Chief Jonas Graves felt something he had not expected to feel about the girl from Washington. He felt afraid, not of her exactly, but of the possibility that he'd been wrong. That he'd been wrong loudly, publicly, and from the very first second, and that everyone had seen it. Reyes found him there an hour later. "You okay, Jonas?" "You ever meet somebody," Graves said slowly, "and everything you know about reading people just doesn't apply?" Reyes leaned against the doorframe. "Once or twice." "What did you do about it?" "I stopped trusting what I thought I knew," Reyes said, "and I started watching what was actually in front of me." He paused. "You might try that, before this thing turns around and bites you." Graves didn't answer, but he thought about it. He thought about it all night. The next morning, something shifted in the unit quietly the way weather changes before anyone announces it. Callahan handed Aravance a water bottle without being asked. Torres asked her awkwardly how she'd learned to time her hands to the tremor, and she showed him, and he actually thanked her. Kowalski said nothing, but he stopped, dropping back to run beside her and taunt her, which was in its own way a kind of surrender. The men were beginning to notice what Reyes had noticed, and what Graves was fighting so hard to deny. That the girl didn't compete the way they competed. She didn't burn hot and try to dominate. She stayed cool, stayed watchful, and somehow always ended up exactly where she needed to be. She calculated. She saw the whole board while everyone else saw only their own square. And it was starting to occur to some of them in the private way that men don't say out loud, that this might be worth more than raw strength. That in the field, when everything went wrong, the person who stayed calm and saw clearly might be the difference between coming home and not. Only Graves refused to say it. He watched her improve, watched the men warm to her, and dug his heels in harder because he'd staked his authority on her failure, and he did not know how to walk that back. He'd spat on the ground in front of her boots on day one. He'd told his men she'd cry herself home. He'd made himself the loudest voice in the room, and now the room was starting to disagree with him. And pride is a heavy thing to set down after you've carried it that long. So when the schedule turned to the kill house, Graves saw an opportunity. The kill house was chaos. It was close quarters, split-second decisions, tactical confusion by design. It was, he told himself, exactly the kind of environment where a 17-year-old girl's calm, calculating mind would finally meet a problem it couldn't solve fast enough. Real combat wasn't a math test. It was noise and speed and instinct came from years he knew she didn't have. Tomorrow, the kill house, he announced to the unit that evening. Full team runs, and we move as a unit, we clear as a unit, we live or die as a unit. His eyes settled on Aravance. In there, thinking too much gets you killed. There's no time to calculate. You just react. We'll see how our genius does when the clock's running and there's no room to be clever. Aravance met his gaze, and for the first time something moved behind her calm expression, something that might almost have been the ghost of a smile. Yes, Master Chief, she said quietly. I've been looking forward to it. That night, while the men slept, she lay awake on her bunk in the corner of the two hot barracks, and she did what she always did. She built the map. She thought about the kill house, about the way chaos had a structure, if you were willing to look for it, about the difference between reacting and seeing. She thought about her father and the porch and the three things you could always learn about a person if you were patient enough to watch. And she thought about Master Chief Jonas Graves, who was so certain he understood the desert, so certain he understood her, so certain that being loud was the same as being right. Tomorrow in the kill house, all of that certainty was going to meet something it hadn't planned for. She'd already seen it. She'd already seen the whole thing the way she saw most things a few steps before they happened. She just closed her eyes and waited for morning. Morning came the way it always did in the desert, fast and without mercy. And by the time the unit gathered outside the kill house, the temperature had already climbed past 90. Graves stood in front of them with a clipboard he didn't need because he had the whole exercise memorized, and he used the pause to let his eyes drift over Aravance one more time. Listen up, he said. The kill house is the closest thing we've got to the real thing. Rooms, corners, hallways, targets that look like hostiles and targets that look like civilians, and you've got a fraction of a second to tell the difference. We run it as a team. Torres, you're on point. Callahan second. Kowalski Doyle, your rear security. Reyes and I observe. He paused. Vance, you're in the stack, middle. You do what the man in front of you does, and you don't get creative. Understand? Yes, Master Chief. I mean it. In their thinking is the enemy. You hesitate, you die. Your team dies. There's no time to run the numbers. He tapped the clipboard against his leg. This is where all that calculating of yours falls apart. Combat's not a chess game. Aravance said nothing, but Reyes, standing off to the side, caught something in her expression that Graves missed entirely. It wasn't nervousness. It was the look of someone listening to a man describe a thing he didn't fully understand and choosing out of respect or patience or strategy not to correct him yet. They geared up, training weapon simulation rounds that stung but didn't kill, sensors clipped to their vests that would register a hit and lock the weapon, marking the wearer as down. The whole thing was wired to a control room where the outcome would be recorded, every shot, every casualty, every second. One more thing, Graves said as they lined up at the entry point. There are surprises in there. There always are. Trip hazards, hidden targets, things designed to catch you off guard. That's the point. In the field, the thing that kills you is the thing you didn't see coming. He looked directly at Aravance when he said it, so keep your eyes open. All of you. Torres blew out a breath. Callahan rolled his neck. Kowalski cracked his knuckles. And Aravance simply stood still and quiet, her eyes already moving over the entrance, the door frame, the scuff marks on the threshold where 100 boots had crossed before. On my mark, Graves said. He raised his hand. 3, 2, 1, go. They breached. The next 90 seconds were exactly the kind of controlled chaos the kill house was built to create. Torres pushed through the first door and called a corner. Callahan cleared the opposite side. Simulation targets popped up, cardboard silhouettes with weapons and cardboard silhouettes with grocery bags, and the men made their calls in fractions of a second, firing on the threats and holding on the innocents. It was fast and loud and violent, and Aravance moved through it in the middle of the stack, doing exactly what she'd been told, her weapon up her steps precise. But she wasn't just moving, she was reading. She read the flow of the rooms, the pattern of the target placements, the rhythm of the exercise designers who'd built this thing. There was a logic to it, a hand behind the chaos, and she was following that hand the way you'd follow a set of footprints. They cleared the first 3 rooms clean. Graves, watching from behind, felt a flicker of something that might have been disappointment. The girl was doing fine. That wasn't what he'd wanted to see. He'd wanted to see her freeze. And then they reached the hallway. It was narrow dim a straight shot toward a doorway at the far end where the sensors indicated the final objective waited. Torres started forward at a crouch, moving quick and low, exactly as he'd been trained. Aravan saw it before her foot even left the ground. It was almost nothing. A glint. A thread of fishing line stretched at ankle height across the mouth of the hallway, catching the dim light for a fraction of a second, connected to a small box mounted low on the wall. A tripwire. In a live scenario, it would have been rigged to an explosive, a claymore, a whole world of fire and shrapnel funneled down that narrow hallway with nowhere for anyone to go. "Halt," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be, but it cut through the noise like a blade, and Torres on point froze with one boot in the air. "Tripwire," Aravan said. "Ankle height, left wall small box. Don't move forward." For 1 second, the whole stack held, and then Graves, watching from behind, made a decision that he would remember for the rest of his life. "Belay that," he barked. "Keep moving. Torres, advance. There's no wire. She's slowing you down." Torres hesitated. His body was caught between two authorities. The calm voice behind him that had said stop, and the command voice that had said go, and in the split second of that hesitation, he did what most men do when a superior officer overrides a subordinate. He obeyed the rank. "Master Chief!" She called a halt, Reyes said sharply from the observation position. "Let her—" "I gave an order," Graves snapped. "Torres, move." Aravans turned her head just slightly, and in that motion Reyes saw everything she wasn't saying. He saw her understand exactly what was about to happen. He saw her understand that she'd been right, that she'd seen the danger clearly, and that it wasn't going to matter because the man in charge had decided that being in charge was the same thing as being correct. "Master Chief," she said one last time very quietly. "Please." "Move," Graves said. Torres moved. His boot came down across the line and the sensor tripped, and every alarm in the kill house went off at once. The control room registered it instantly. A simulated detonation in a confined hallway at close range, with the entire stack packed into the kill zone with nowhere to run. The vests started locking one after another, the little sensors chirping their electronic death. Torres, Callahan, Doyle, Kowalski, and Aravan standing in the middle of them went down too, because in a real hallway with a real claymore being right about the wire wouldn't have saved her if the man in front of her walked into it anyway. Entire unit, KIA in simulation. The alarms cut off, and a silence fell over the kill house that was heavier than the desert heat, heavier than anything any of them had felt on that base. Nobody moved. The men stood frozen in the hallway, their vests locked, staring at the tripwire that Aravans had called and Graves had overridden. Torres looked down at the thread across his boot as if it were a snake. Callahan slowly turned his head to look at Aravans. Kowalski, the loudest of them, the harshest critic, didn't make a sound. Graves stood at the back of the room and the clipboard hung from his hand, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not know what to say. The control room speaker crackled. "Full team casualty," the technician's voice said, flat and mechanical. "Cause undetected, explosive device hallway." The device was flagged verbally 11 seconds before detonation by a pause. By Vance, the words hung in the air. 11 seconds. She'd seen it 11 seconds before it would have killed them all, and she'd said so clearly twice and it hadn't been enough. Graves walked forward, slowly. He knelt down beside the trip wire and looked at it, really looked at it, the fishing line, the box, the whole thing that had been sitting there in plain sight for anyone patient enough to see it. He'd told them there'd be surprises. He'd told them the thing that kills you is the thing you don't see coming. And a 17-year-old girl had seen it coming, and he had personally, deliberately ordered his men to walk into it. He stood up. He turned to face her. Aravans was already looking at him, not with triumph, not with anger, with something worse than either of those, something that looked almost like sorrow, the expression of a person who had watched a preventable thing happen anyway. "You saw it," Graves said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Master Chief." "You called it twice." "Yes, Master Chief." The men were watching now, all of them, and Graves understood that whatever he said next would define him in their eyes for a long time to come. He could feel the weight of it. He could feel his pride straining against the truth, that same pride that had made him spit on the ground in front of her boots on day one, that same pride that had made him promise his unit she'd cry herself home. He could lie. He could find some reason it wasn't his fault, some technicality, some way to make it about her instead of him. Part of him wanted to badly, but he was underneath all that pride, a man who'd spent 22 years in a profession where lying to yourself got people killed. And so he did the hardest thing he'd done in years. He told the truth. She was right, Graves said. He said it loud enough for every man to hear, the same way he'd said the cruel things loud enough for everyone to hear on the tarmac. I overrode a correct call. I saw a 17-year-old girl tell me to stop, and I decided I knew better because of what she looked like and how old she was. And I just got my entire team killed. He let that sit for a moment. In the field, that's not a simulation. That's 6 folded flags and 6 phone calls to 6 families. Nobody said anything. The admission was so complete, so unflinching, that it left no room for comment. But then Graves did something that surprised even himself. He turned back to Aravance, and instead of leaving it there, instead of letting the moment be a simple story about a girl who was right and a man who was wrong, he gave her a second truth, one that was harder to hear. But here's what you need to understand, he said. You were right, and it didn't matter. You saw it, you called it, and every one of us died anyway. You want to know why? He stepped closer. Because being right isn't enough. You had the answer, and you couldn't make anyone act on it. You said please, twice. You asked me to listen. His voice hardened, not with cruelty now, but with something closer to instruction. In this line of work, the person who's right but can't move the room is just as dead as everybody else. Maybe more because they saw it coming and still couldn't stop it. That's the worst way to go. Aravance held his gaze, and for a long moment the two of them stood there, the loud man and the quiet girl, in the aftermath of a disaster that belonged to both of them in different ways. And then she nodded slowly. You're right, Master Chief, she said. It was the first time either of them had said those words to the other, and it changed something in the room. I saw the wire, Aravance went on, and I thought seeing it was enough. I thought if I told the truth clearly, the truth would win. But you're right. The truth doesn't win on its own. Somebody has to make it win. She paused. That's my lesson from today, and I'll carry it, but you should carry yours too. Graves narrowed his eyes. And what's mine? That the reason I couldn't move the room, she said quietly, is that you spent 7 days teaching the room not to listen to me. You told them I was a mistake from Washington. You told them I'd cry myself home. You built a wall between me and every man in this unit, and then you're standing here surprised that when I hit that wall with the truth, it didn't come down in 11 seconds. She held his eyes. I couldn't move the room because you nailed the room shut. That's not a lesson for me. Master Chief, that's a lesson for you. The silence that followed was absolute. Graves felt the words land, felt them land in front of his men, felt the terrible accuracy of them. She wasn't wrong. She wasn't wrong at all. He'd built the very obstacle that had killed them. His prejudice hadn't just been unfair. It had been tactically catastrophic. A liability. He'd called her a liability from the first minute, and it turned out the liability in the room had been him. Reyes from the observation position let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Because he'd been watching this coming for 7 days, and now it had arrived, and it was even more brutal than he'd expected. For a moment, it looked like Graves might explode, might reach for that pride one last time, and use his rank to bury what she'd just said. His jaw worked, his knuckles whitened around the clipboard, and then slowly the fight went out of him. Yeah, he said, just that, yeah. And in that single word was more surrender than any speech could have carried. Yeah, that's fair. He turned to the rest of the unit and reset, we run it again. And this time when someone in this stack calls a halt, anyone in this stack, we halt. I don't care if it's me, or Reyes, or Torres, or Vance. We halt, we check, we verify. Rank doesn't see the tripwire, eyes see the tripwire. Understood. Understood, Master Chief, the unit answered, and there was something different in the way they said it. They reset. They ran it again. And this time when Aravance's voice came clear and low through the second hallway, calling a threat that the exercise designers had hidden even more cleverly than the first, the entire stack froze as one checked, found it, and neutralized it. They cleared the kill house clean, full team survival. The control room crackled. Full clear, no casualties, nice work. The men filed out into the brutal light, pulling off their helmets, wiping the sweat from their faces, and something had changed among them. Something that couldn't be undone. Torres was the first to say it. He walked straight up to Aravance and he stuck out his hand. You saved my life, he said. I mean, I know it's a simulation, but you saw it and you said stop, and if that had been real, I'd be dead right now. I walked right into it because I trusted the wrong voice. That's not gonna happen again. He shook her hand firmly. Thank you. Aravance shook it. You did the right thing under pressure, she said. You obeyed your command. That's not a flaw, Torres. That's discipline. The problem wasn't you. She didn't say the rest. She didn't have to. Callahan came next. He didn't shake her hand, but he stood in front of her and he was quiet for a second, and then he said, I told you on the first day it'd be easier for everybody if you just went home quietly. He shook his head. I was wrong. It'd be a whole lot worse for everybody if you'd gone home. I'm glad you didn't. He paused. For what it's worth, I don't think you're a mistake from Washington. I think you might be the most careful person I've ever run with. And in our line of work, careful keeps people breathing. Even Kowalski, who had taunted her on that first run, who had grinned in her face and told her she'd be screaming for a medevac, walked past her on his way to the water station, slowed down and said without quite meeting her eyes, good call in there, kid. And from Kowalski, that was practically a symphony. But Reyes waited. He waited until the others had drifted off, until it was just him and Aravance standing in the shade of the kill house. And then he came over and studied her the way he'd studied her file, with that quiet, watchful attention. Can I ask you something? He said. Of course. That thing you said to Graves about him nailing the room shut. Reyes tilted his head. You could have just been the girl who was right. Everybody would have felt sorry for you, and it would have been the easy win. But you turned it around and put it back on him in front of his own men, and you did it without raising your voice. He paused. Most 17-year-olds don't have the nerve. Most 40-year-olds don't have the nerve. Where'd you learn to do that? Aravance was quiet for a moment, and then she said something she hadn't said to anyone on that base. My father, she said. He used to tell me that the truth is a weapon, but it's useless if you fire it and miss. He said you have to aim it. You have to know who needs to hear it and when they're ready to hear it and exactly where it'll do the most good. She looked out at the desert. Graves wasn't ready to hear it standing at the back of the room, but he was ready to hear it after he'd already admitted he was wrong out loud. That's when the truth would land, so that's when I fired. Reyes stared at her. Your father sounds like a hell of a man. Was he military? Something flickered across Aravance's face so fast Reyes almost missed it. A shadow, a door opening and closing. He was, she said, he was a lot of things. And she left it there, and Reyes was smart enough not to push, but he filed it away the way she filed things away, because he understood now that there was a whole story behind this girl, a story that explained the calm and the calculation and the bottom. She'd said she'd already found, and that whatever that story was, it was the key to understanding what she'd become. That evening, Graves sat alone in his office again, and this time when Reyes came to the door, Graves spoke first. I've been doing this 22 years, he said, and I've never been that wrong about a person. Not once. I pride myself on reading people. It's the one thing I know I'm good at, and I read her completely, totally backwards. He rubbed his face. What does that make me, Reyes? Reyes came in and sat down across from him. It makes you human, he said. You saw a 17-year-old girl and your brain filled in the rest before you had any data. Everybody does that. The difference between a good man and a bad one isn't whether you make the assumption. It's what you do when the data comes back and proves you wrong. He leaned forward. And today in front of your whole unit, you looked at the data and you said she was right. You didn't hide behind your rank. That's more than most men could have done. She said I nailed the room shut. She was right about that too. Graves winced. Yeah, I know. He was quiet for a while. You read her file, all of it. What aren't you telling me? Reyes hesitated. It was the first time he'd hesitated about anything since he'd arrived. There's stuff in there that's above my clearances to talk about honestly. But I'll tell you what I can. He chose his words carefully. That program that sent her here, the classified evaluation. It's not what you think it is. Command isn't trying to prove that anybody can be a SEAL. They're not making a political statement. He met Graves's eyes. They found her somewhere. Under circumstances nobody's told me the full shape of. And what they found was someone who'd already survived something that would have killed most trained operators. She didn't come here to learn how to survive, Jonas. She came here already knowing how. The evaluation isn't testing whether she can make it. It's testing whether we're good enough to recognize what she already is. Graves sat with that for a long moment. What did she survive? He asked quietly. I don't know all of it, Reyes admitted, but I know this. When she said there's nothing you can do in this desert worse than what she's already lived through, she wasn't being dramatic. She was telling you the plain truth. And you spent 7 days trying to break a person who's already been broken and rebuilt herself from the pieces. You were never going to find her bottom, Jonas. She left it behind a long time ago. The office was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning fighting the desert. I owe her more than an apology, Graves said finally. You owe her an evaluation that's actually honest, Reyes said. You owe her the chance to show what she can do without you standing on the scale. That's all she ever wanted. She didn't come here to prove she's better than your men. She came here to be seen clearly. And so far, you're the only one who won't look. Graves nodded slowly. He looked older than he had that morning, but there was something else in his face too. Something that hadn't been there before. The beginnings of respect, maybe. Or the willingness to earn the right to give it. The sniper range, he said. That's next. That's the hard one. Nobody's gone perfect on it in 14 years. Not one operator. He looked up at Reyes. You think she can do it? Reyes stood up to leave. He paused at the door and there was the faintest trace of a smile on his usually impassive face. I think he said that for the first time in 14 years you might want to keep your eyes open. Because I don't think you have any idea what you're about to see. And he walked out, leaving Graves alone with the question and the raw desert night and the growing uncomfortable certainty that everything he thought he knew was about to be rewritten one more time. Across the compound in the corner of the two hot barracks, Eravance lay awake on her bunk with her eyes open in the dark. She'd felt the shift today. She'd felt the men change, felt the wall Graves had built start to come down brick by brick. Torres shaking her hand, Callahan admitting he'd been wrong. Kowalski's grudging 2 words. It should have felt like a victory. Part of her knew that it was won, but she didn't let herself feel it that way. She'd learned a long time ago on a porch in the high country, and in the darkness that came after that, the moment you start needing other people to see you is the moment you hand them power over you. She hadn't come here to be liked. She hadn't come here to win them over. She'd come here for a reason that none of them knew yet, a reason that lived behind the door Reyes had been smart enough not to open. She thought about her father. She thought about the last thing he'd ever taught her, the lesson that hadn't been about reading people or aiming the truth or timing your movements to the tremor in your hands. The lesson that had come at the very end in the worst moment of her life, the moment that had given her the bottom she told Graves about. She thought about the rifle. Tomorrow they'd hand her a weapon and ask her to hit targets no one had hit clean in 14 years. Moving targets, heat distortion, unknown distances, 1,200 meters of desert air between her and a truth she'd been carrying for longer than any of them could imagine. They thought it was a test. She closed her eyes. They had no idea. The morning of the sniper evaluation, Aravance was up before the others again, but this time she wasn't standing outside waiting to prove a point. This time she was sitting on the edge of her bunk with her hands open in her lap, breathing slow, doing the thing her father had taught her to do before she ever touched a rifle. Empty the noise, he used to say. Empty the noise until there's nothing left but you and the target in the distance between. Reyes found her like that when he came to wake the unit. He stopped in the doorway and watched her for a second, and he understood in the way that one careful person recognizes another that he was looking at a ritual. Something older than this base. Something that came from somewhere else. You ready? He asked. Aravance opened her eyes. I've been ready for a long time, she said. Out at the range, Graves was already waiting, and he'd brought company. There was a man Aravance didn't recognize, older in civilian clothes that fit him wrong, the way clothes fit a man who'd spent his whole life in a uniform and never got comfortable out of one. He stood a little apart watching, and the way the other instructors gave him space told her he mattered. Vance Graves said as the unit assembled. His tone had changed since the kill house. It wasn't warm, not yet, but it had lost its edge. This is the sniper evaluation. It's the hardest thing we do here, and I'm not going to soften that for you. He gestured out at the range where targets sat at varying distances, some fixed, some mounted on rails that would carry them across the sand. Moving targets, heat distortion off the ground that'll bend your sight picture. Unknown engagement distances, meaning you don't get told how far you have to read it yourself. And it finishes at 1,200 meters, live pressure, 1 attempt scored. He paused and something almost like honesty came into his voice. I've run this range for 14 years. In that time, I've watched the best operators the Navy's ever produced come through here and put up good numbers. Great numbers, some of them. But nobody, not one single person, has ever shot it clean. Perfect, because at 1,200 meters in this heat, with the wind coming off that ridge, the way it does, there's always something. The desert always takes one shot from you. Always. He looked at her. So I'm not asking you to be perfect. Nobody's perfect out here. I'm asking you to show me what you've got. Aravance looked out at the range for a long moment. She read the distances, the way she read everything patiently, letting the numbers assemble themselves. She read the shimmer of heat rising off the sand, the way it would lift and distort a target at 800 meters, 900, 1,000. She read the wind, the flags out on the range snapping, and then going slack, and then snapping again. A wind that couldn't make up its mind, the worst kind, the kind that punished you for trusting it. Who's the man in the civilian clothes? She asked quietly. Graves glanced at him. That's Commander Hale. He's from the program, the one that sent you here. He hesitated. He flew in this morning, specifically for this. And there it was, the confirmation of something Aravance had suspected since the moment she'd seen Hale standing apart from the others. This wasn't a normal evaluation station. Somebody had come a long way to watch her shoot. Somebody who knew things about her that the men on this base didn't. She felt her heart do something it rarely did. It moved, just slightly, because Commander Hale's face was not entirely unfamiliar to her, and the reason it wasn't familiar had everything to do with the door she'd kept closed since she arrived. Have I met him? She asked, and her voice was very even, the way it always was when something underneath it was not. Graves frowned. I don't know. Have you? She didn't answer. She looked back at the range. Commander Hale, for his part, had not taken his eyes off her since she'd walked up. And there was something in his expression that none of the SEALs could read, but that Reyes, watching from the side, clocked immediately. It wasn't the look of an evaluator sizing up a candidate. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost. The look of someone who had known this girl before, or known someone she reminded him of so completely that it hurt to look at her. Let's begin, Graves said. Vance, you're up first. The rest of you observe. And keep your comments to yourselves. He handed her the rifle. She took it, and the moment her hands closed around it, everyone watching saw the change. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't transform. But something in her settled the way a compass needle settles when you stop moving the way a thing finds the place it was made for. The rifle looked too big for her, and in her hands it looked like it had always been there. She moved to the firing position and lay down behind it, and she went still. The first target was at 400 meters. Fixed. A gimme by sniper standards, but nobody treated the first shot as a gimme because the first shot set the rhythm for everything that came after. She settled in, controlled her breathing, and the range went quiet. She didn't rush it. That was the first thing every man watching noticed. She didn't hurry to prove herself. She lay there breathing, reading, and the seconds stretched out 5, 10, 15, and Kowalski shifted his weight and started to think maybe she was choking. Maybe the pressure of the commander watching had finally found the crack in her that 7 days of desert couldn't, and then she fired. The 400-meter target rang like a struck bell dead center, and the spotter called it before the echo faded. Hit, center mass. Nobody said anything. 400 meters was easy. Anybody could hit 400. But there was something about the way she'd done it, the total absence of doubt, the way she'd taken exactly as long as she needed, and not 1 second more, that made the silence a little different than it had been. 600, Graves said. The second target sat farther out, and at 600 meters, the heat distortion started to bite the air, rising off the sand in visible waves that bent the light and made the target seem to swim. Aravance adjusted. Nobody told her how. She read the shimmer, understood what it was doing to her sight picture, and compensated for it in her head, and she went still again. This time she took less time. She'd found her rhythm now. She breathed, she settled, she fired. Hit, center mass. Torres let out a low whistle before he could stop himself. Callahan elbowed him, but Callahan was grinning too. 800, Graves said, and his voice had gone quieter. 800 meters was where good shooters started to separate from great ones. The margin for error shrank to almost nothing. A tiny misread of the wind, a fractional error in your range estimate, and the round would sail wide or drop short. And the wind out there was still lying, snapping the flags one direction, and then dying, and then coming back from somewhere else entirely. Aravance watched the flags. She watched them for a long time, longer than she'd taken on either previous shot, and every man on that range understood without being told that she wasn't hesitating. She was waiting. She was waiting for the wind to tell the truth for one honest moment in its lying, and she had the patience to wait for it no matter how long it took. The wind snapped, died, came back, snapped again. And then for just a second, the flags went slack all the way down the range at once. A pocket of stillness, a window. She fired into the window. Hit! Center mass! Now the silence had teeth. Now every man on the range was doing the same math, and the math said that a 17-year-old girl who'd stepped off a transport 8 days ago with a rifle too big for her was 3 for 3 at distances that humbled trained operators, and she hadn't so much as flinched. Commander Hale had moved closer without anyone noticing. He was standing just behind the firing line now, watching her hands, watching her breathing, and his face had gone pale beneath the desert tan. Graves saw it. Graves saw the commander's face, and he filed it away with everything else that was starting to not add up, and he called the next distance. 950. This was the one that broke people. 950 meters, moving target. The silhouette sat mounted on a rail system that would carry it across the sand at an unpredictable speed, and the shooter had to lead it, had to fire not where it was, but where it would be, calculating the target's motion and the round's flight time, and the wind's interference all at once in her head in real time. Target's moving on my mark, the spotter said. This one moves. You've got to lead it. Most people miss this one clean. Don't feel bad if you do. He paused. Mark. The target lurched into motion, sliding across the range, and Aravance tracked it. Everyone watching held their breath. She tracked it, leading it, her body moving with a smoothness that seemed impossible. No jerk, no hesitation, just a continuous flowing motion that matched the target's speed exactly. And she waited, and the target was 2/3 of the way across its track, and people were starting to think she'd missed her chance. She fired. The round crossed 950 meters of bending, shimmering desert air and met the moving target dead center, and the silhouette rang and rocked on its rail. Hit, the spotter said, and his voice cracked. Center, mass, on a mover at 950. He turned and looked at Graves. Master Chief, I've never seen anybody hit that one clean on the first try. Never. Graves didn't answer. He was watching Commander Hale, whose hand had come up to cover his mouth. Kowalski, the harshest critic, the man who taunted her on that first run, said out loud what everyone was thinking. Who is this kid? It came out almost desperate. I mean it. Who is she? People don't shoot like that. You don't just, nobody does that. He turned to Doyle. You seeing this? Tell me you're seeing this. I'm seeing it, Doyle said quietly. I just don't believe it. 4 for 4, and only one target left. 1,200, Graves said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. 1,200 meters. This is the one, Vance. This is the one nobody's beaten in 14 years. If you hit this clean, you'll be the first, ever. He crouched down near her. No pressure, but you should know what you're standing on the edge of. Aravance was quiet for a moment. Then she said, without taking her eyes off the distant target, Master Chief, can I ask you something before I take the shot? Go ahead. The wind off that ridge, you said it always takes one shot in 14 years. She adjusted her position by a fraction. What direction does it come from right before it takes the shot? Do you know? Have you watched it long enough to know its pattern? Graves blinked. In 14 years, nobody had ever asked him that. They'd all treated the wind as random, as the hand of God, as the thing that took your perfect score. And there was nothing you could do about it. But she wasn't asking whether she could beat the wind. She was asking whether the wind had a pattern, whether the thing everyone treated as random was actually just complicated, and whether he'd been paying enough attention over 14 years to have learned it. It comes from the northwest, Graves said slowly, realizing as he said it that he did know that he'd watched it 1,000 times and never put it into words. Off that ridge, it builds for about 10-15 seconds, and then it gusts hard, and that's when it takes the shot. Then it settles. There's maybe a 4-second window after the gust where it's calm before it starts building again. Aravance nodded once. "Thank you," she said. "That's what I needed." And then she did something that made the whole range lean in. She didn't take the shot. She waited. She lay there behind the rifle at 1,200 meters, and she watched the wind build. Watched it off that northwest ridge. Watched it build the way Graves had told her it would. 10 seconds, 15, and then it gusted hard. A punishing gust that would have taken the shot from anyone who'd fired into it. She held. She let the gust pass. She let the wind take the shot it always took, except this time there was no shot for it to take, because she hadn't fired. And then in the 4-second window of calm that came after the honest window, the one Graves had just described to her and never once thought to use himself in 14 years, she fired. 1,200 meters, the longest 4 seconds any of them had ever lived through. The round left the barrel and crossed the distance, and nobody breathed, and the heat shimmered, and the target sat out there impossibly far, a speck, a dream of a target. The silhouette rang. "Hit!" the spotter shouted, and his professional calm shattered completely. "Center mass, 1,200 meters, clean. That's Master Chief, that's a perfect run. 5 for 5. That's the first perfect run on this range in 14 years. She did it. She actually did it." For a moment, nobody moved. And then the range erupted. Torres was on his feet yelling. Callahan was pounding Doyle on the back. Even Kowalski had thrown his hands up and was shouting something incoherent at the sky. 8 days ago, these men had watched a 17-year-old girl step off a transport and dismissed her as a mistake from Washington. And now they were losing their minds because she'd just done something none of them could do, something none of their heroes had done, something that would be talked about on this base long after every one of them had rotated out. But Aravance didn't move. She stayed behind the rifle, still and quiet, and Reyes, watching her, understood that for her, this wasn't the celebration the men thought it was. This was something else. This was a door. "Reset the 1,200, Aravance said, cutting through the noise. Her voice wasn't loud, but it stopped the celebration cold. "I want to take it again." The range went quiet. "Vance," Graves said carefully, "you don't have to. You already did it. It's scored. You're the first person in 14 years. "I know," she said. "Reset it. Please. I need to take it again." There was something in the way she said it that made Graves stop arguing. He nodded to the spotter, and the 1,200-meter target was reset, and Aravance settled in behind the rifle again, and she watched the wind build off the northwest ridge, and she waited for the gust, and she held through it, and she fired into the calm. The silhouette rang. "Hit," the spotter said, quieter now, almost reverent. "Center, again." "Again," Aravance said. She fired again. "Hit, again." She fired again. "Hit, 5 for 5 at 1,200 meters. Not once. Not luck. Not a fluke that could be explained away. She'd done the impossible thing, and then she'd done it 4 more times in a row, methodically, calmly, until there was no argument left, until the data could not be denied by anyone, no matter how badly they wanted to. And when she was done, she set the rifle down, and she lay there for a moment with her forehead nearly touching the sand, and Reyes was the only one close enough to see that her shoulders were shaking just slightly, and that it had nothing to do with fatigue. She got up. She stood and she turned around and she looked past all the cheering men, past Graves who had gone completely silent, and she looked directly at Commander Hale. And Commander Hale looked back at her and his eyes were wet, and he said in a voice that carried across the suddenly quiet range, "You count the wind, you wait through the gust and fire into the calm." He swallowed. "There's only one person I ever knew who shot like that, who had the patience to let the wind take its shot first." He took a step toward her. "Where did you learn to do that, young lady?" The range had gone completely silent again. Every man was watching now, sensing that something was happening that had nothing to do with the evaluation, something older and deeper. Aravance held the commander's gaze. "You know where I learned it," she said quietly. "You knew the second you saw me shoot. Didn't you?" Commander Hale's face crumpled. "Vance," he said. "Aravance, I need you to tell me. Your father—" "Master Sergeant Elias Vance," Aravance said, and her voice was steady, but everyone could hear the weight underneath it, the years of it. "You served with him. That's why you flew out here this morning." That's why you've been staring at me since I walked up. Because I shoot exactly like him. I count the wind exactly like him. Because he's the one who taught me. On a hillside in the high country when I was 8 years old. She paused. He taught me everything, and then she stopped. Graves was looking back and forth between them, and the pieces were assembling in his mind with terrible speed. The classified program, the commander flying in, the girl who'd already found her bottom, who'd survived something worse than any desert. Master Sergeant Elias Vance. Elias Vance, Graves said slowly. I know that name. Everybody knows that name. He stopped and his face changed. He was the sniper on that mission, the one that went bad 4 years ago, the one where the whole team. He stopped again because he'd just done the math on how old she was and when the mission was and what it meant. 3 years ago, Erevan said, I was 14. Her voice never wavered, but it had gone very quiet and the whole range strained to hear it. He didn't come home. None of them did. And when the men in uniform came to the door to tell my mother, I already knew, because I'd learned to read people from him, and I read it on their faces before they said a word. She looked at Hale. You were one of them. You were at the door. I remember you. Hale nodded, unable to speak. So no, Erevan said, and now she turned to include all of them, Graves and Reyes and Torres and Callahan and Kowalski and Doyle, all these men who'd spent 8 days deciding what she was. I didn't come here to prove I could survive. I already survived the worst thing that will ever happen to me. And I didn't come here to learn how to shoot. My father taught me before he died on a hillside, one honest window of wind at a time. Her voice finally caught just slightly, just once. I came here because when they told my mother my father was gone, they also told her his death would be classified, sealed, that we'd never know what happened on that mission or why or whether it could have been stopped. She looked at Commander Hale. And this program, the one that found me, the one that sent me here, it's the only door that leads to the truth about my father. Isn't it, Commander? That's the real deal. That's why I'm here. I pass this evaluation, I get access. I get to know how he died. The silence on the range was total. The wind off the northwest ridge built and gusted and settled, and nobody moved. Graves looked at the girl he'd spat in front of on day one, the girl he'd called a mistake from Washington, the girl he tried to break for 7 days, and he understood at last the full shape of his error. She'd never been a political experiment. She'd never been a favor to someone in D.C. She was the daughter of one of the most respected snipers the teams had ever produced, a man who died on a mission so sensitive, they'd sealed the truth away from his own family. And she'd spent 3 years turning her grief into the one skill that might buy her the answers. She'd trained herself into an instrument precise enough that a classified program couldn't ignore her. She'd made herself impossible to dismiss. And he'd dismissed her anyway, loudly, on the tarmac, in front of everyone. Commander, Graves said, and his voice was rough. Is she right? Is that what this is? Hale wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked at Aravance for a long moment, and then he made a decision that Graves could see cost him something. Elias Vance was the best I ever served with, Hale said. And what happened to him and his team 3 years ago was not an accident, and it was not the enemy's fault, and it should never have been sealed. His jaw tightened. There are people who wanted it buried. There are people who are still walking around free because it got buried. And when this girl started shattering records at a junior marksmanship program 2 years ago, shooting like a ghost, shooting like him, some of us who knew Elias, who owed Elias, we saw a chance. He looked at Aravance. The program is real. The evaluation is real. And yes, you pass this, you're in. And once you're in, you have the clearance to open the file on your father's last mission. That was always the deal. That's what I flew out here to see. Whether you were really as good as the report said. He shook his head slowly. You're better. God help me, you're better than he was. Aravance closed her eyes for just a second. When she opened them, they were dry and steady again. Then I passed, she said. It wasn't a question. You passed, Hale said. You passed 3 targets ago. Everything after that was just you making sure nobody could ever say it was luck. A ghost of a sad smile crossed his face. Your father used to do that too. He never trusted people to believe the first shot. He always fired until there was no argument left. Graves stood there and he felt about 2 inches tall, and he felt something else too. something that had been building in him since the kill house and had just now finally broken all the way through. He felt shame, yes, but underneath the shame, he felt an enormous aching respect, the kind of respect that hurts because you know you didn't give it when it was owed. He walked over to Eravance. The men watched, and Master Chief Jonas Graves, 22 years in the teams, did something he had never once done to a candidate on an evaluation range. He came to attention and he saluted her. "Miss Vance," he said, "I owe you an apology that I don't have words big enough for. I looked at you and I saw everything except who you actually were. Your father was a legend in these teams. And you, so," his voice caught, "you're going to be one too. And I'm going to spend whatever time I've got left in this program making sure that every man who comes through here learns the thing you taught me 8 days too late. That the loudest voice in the room isn't the one worth listening to. It's the quietest one, the one that's been watching, the one that already sees the whole thing." He held the salute. "It would be the honor of my career to help you finish this evaluation and to help you get to your father's truth." Eravance looked at the saluting Master Chief and at the men behind him and at Commander Hale with his wet eyes, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that transport, something in her face softened all the way. She returned the salute. "Thank you, Master Chief," she said, "but I'm not done yet." She looked out at the range at the 1,200-meter target still ringing faintly in the wind. "Passing was never the point. My father's truth was the point. And that door only opens if I finish everything they put in front of me. Every station, every test." Her jaw set. "So no, this isn't the end of the evaluation. This is the beginning of it, because now that they know what I can do, they're going to want to be sure. Really sure. They're going to throw everything they have left at me." She looked at Hale. "Aren't they, Commander?" Hale's sad smile faded into something more serious. "Yes," he said quietly. "They are. And Eravance, there's something you need to know about who's watching this evaluation. Something about why the file got sealed in the first place." He glanced around at the men at Graves and lowered his voice. "Some of the people who buried your father's truth, they're not gone, and they know you're here. They know exactly what you're trying to do." He held her gaze. "You made yourself impossible to ignore. That was brilliant. But it means you're also impossible to hide from now. And there are people who would very much prefer that this door stays closed forever." Eravance did not flinch. She looked back at the commander with the same calm she'd carried off the transport 8 days before the calm her father had taught her on a hillside a lifetime ago. The calm that came from having already survived the worst thing the world could do to her. "Good," she said softly. "Let them watch. Let them worry." She picked up the rifle again and held it the way it was meant to be held, like it had always been there. "I've been waiting 3 years for them to make a mistake. And people who are worried make mistakes." She looked out at the desert, at the long distances, at the lying wind off the northwest ridge that she had learned at last to beat. "All I have to do is keep doing what he taught me. Empty the noise, count the wind, and wait for the honest window." And out on the range, the wind built off the ridge and gusted and settled into calm. That night, the barracks felt different. The wall Graves had built was gone, torn down, not by anyone's kindness, but by 5 perfect shots and a truth nobody had seen coming, and in its place was something the unit hadn't had before. Not quite family, but the beginning of it. Torres couldn't stop talking about the 1200. Callahan kept shaking his head every few minutes like he was still arguing with what he'd seen. And Kowalski, who'd taunted her on that first run, sat down on the end of Aravance's bunk uninvited, which for Kowalski was an act of intimacy. "I gotta ask you something," Kowalski said, "and you can tell me to go to hell. But your dad, Master Sergeant Vance, when he taught you all that the win, the waiting, all of it, did he know? Did he know you were going to be better than him?" Aravance was quiet for a moment. "He used to say I already was," she said. "I thought he was just being a father. Now I think maybe he saw something I didn't." She looked at Kowalski. "He'd have liked you, you know. He always said the loud ones were the easiest to read and the easiest to forgive. It's the quiet ones you have to watch." Kowalski laughed a rough, surprised bark. "Yeah, well, turns out he was right about that." He stood up. "For what it's worth, kid, I'm glad I was wrong about you. I've been wrong about a lot of things in my life, and most of them I regret. This one I don't." But across the compound in Graves's office, the mood was not celebratory. Commander Hale had stayed, and he'd asked Graves and Reyes to stay too, And now the three of them sat in the small hot room with the door closed, and Hale laid out the thing he'd only hinted at on the range. I need you both to understand what you've walked into, Hale said, because I don't think you do. When I told that girl her father's death was sealed, I made it sound like bureaucracy. Red tape, it's not. He leaned forward. Elias Vance and his team were sent on a mission 3 years ago that never should have happened. The intelligence was wrong, and it wasn't wrong by accident. Somebody manufactured it. Somebody sent 8 of the best operators this country ever produced into a kill box on purpose to cover up something they'd done, and then sealed the whole thing so nobody could ever prove it. Graves felt his stomach turn over. You're telling me somebody murdered them? Our own people. I'm telling you, that's what Elias's daughter is going to find when she opens that file, Hale said. And I'm telling you that the men who did it are still in positions of power, still wearing the uniform, some of them. And they have been watching this evaluation from the day she arrived, because the day Aravance Vance walked onto this base, she became the single greatest threat to their freedom that exists in this world. He let that sit. A grieving daughter is one thing. A grieving daughter with a security clearance and access to the file is something they cannot allow. Reyes had gone very still. Then why let her in at all? If they're that powerful, why not just bury her application? Wash her out on paper? Because some of us are watching too, Hale said. Some of us who owed Elias. We made noise. We made her impossible to disappear quietly. Right now there's a stalemate. They can't fail her without cause because too many people are watching. And if a girl who just shot the first perfect run in 14 years gets mysteriously washed out, that's a story that writes itself. He rubbed his face. But a stalemate isn't safety. It just means they'll be looking for cause. They'll be looking for a legitimate reason to end her evaluation. An accident, a failure, something that looks natural. He looked at Graves. And that's where you come in, Master Chief, because you run the remaining stations. And if you're not careful, they will use your evaluation to kill her, not with a bullet, with a check mark in the wrong box. The room was silent. Graves stood up slowly. He walked to the small window and looked out at the dark compound at the barracks where the girl he'd wronged was sitting with his men. 8 days ago, he said, I'd have given them the check mark and never thought twice. I looked at her and I saw everything they'd want me to see. Too young, too small, too fragile. If they'd come to me on day 2 and said, find a reason to fail her, I'd have had a dozen ready. He turned around and his face was hard. But I'm not that man tonight. That girl taught me something in the kill house that I should have learned 20 years ago. And she taught me something on that range this morning that I'll never forget. And I will be damned, Commander. I will be damned before I let a bunch of cowards use my evaluation to finish the job they started on her father. Hale studied him for a long moment. You understand that puts you in their crosshairs too. I understand, Graves said. I've been in worse. Reyes stood up as well. Count me in. I read her file the first day. I knew there was something they weren't telling me. I'm not sitting on my hands now that I know what it is. Hale nodded slowly and some of the weight seemed to lift off him. Then here's what you need to know. The remaining evaluation stations are the ones where an accident is plausible. Live fire exercises. High-stress scenarios with real risk. The kind of thing where a piece of equipment can fail, or an order can get garbled, or a round can go somewhere it shouldn't. And afterward, everyone just shakes their heads and says, what a tragedy she showed such promise. He looked between the two of them. The most dangerous one is the combined assault exercise. Live rounds, moving elements, multiple shooters control chaos. It's the last major station before she qualifies. If they're going to move, they'll move there. And it's day after tomorrow. The next morning, Aravance knew something had changed before anyone told her. She could read it on Graves, who was watching the perimeter differently now. The way her father used to watch a tree line. She could read it on Reyes, who'd stopped being merely observant and started being vigilant. And she could read it on Hale, who hadn't left, who was supposed to have flown back and hadn't. She waited until she found Graves alone checking equipment in the armory, and she walked up beside him. You know, she said quietly. Graves didn't pretend not to understand. He'd learned that much about her at least. You didn't play dumb with Aravance Vance. She'd already read the answer off your face. How much did you figure out on your own? He asked. Most of it, she said. I've known since I was 14 that my father's death wasn't clean. You don't seal a man's last mission from his own family unless there's something in it somebody's afraid of. I've spent 3 years assuming somebody did this to him on purpose. I trained for 3 years on that assumption. She picked up a magazine, checked it, set it down with the unconscious competence of someone who'd handled thousands. The only thing I didn't know for sure was whether they'd still be watching, whether they'd care enough to come after me too. She looked at him. Commander Hale confirmed it yesterday in the way he warned me, and you've been watching the perimeter like a man expecting company. So, they're coming, aren't they? Graves set down the rifle he was holding. The combined assault exercise. Tomorrow. Hale thinks that's where they'll make their move. Live rounds, cast plausible accident. He met her eyes. I want you to know that whatever they've got planned, they're going to have to come through me first. Me and Reyes. And I don't think they counted on that. I don't think they counted on the fact that you'd change the minds of the very men they were relying on to look the other way. Something moved across Aravance's face, and for a moment she looked exactly like what she was. A 17-year-old girl who'd lost her father and carried it alone for 3 years and was now for the first time not entirely alone. Why, she asked quietly, 8 days ago you spat on the ground in front of my boots. You called me a mistake. Why are you willing to put yourself in front of this for me now? Graves was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. Because I spent 22 years telling young operators that the job is about seeing clearly, he said. About stripping away what you want to be true so you can see what is true. And then a 17-year-old girl walked onto my base, and I failed my own lesson worse than any recruit I ever washed out. I saw what I wanted to see instead of what was there. He shook his head. And then you stood in that kill house right after I got you and my whole team killed, and instead of gloating, you taught me. You told me I'd nailed the room shut. You were right. You've been right about everything, and you've done it without ever once being cruel about it. He looked at her. Your father raised a hell of a person, and if some cowards think they're going to use my range to erase you the way they erased him, they picked the wrong Master Chief. That's why. Aravance didn't say anything for a moment. Then she nodded once, and Graves understood that from her, that single nod was worth more than a speech. Then I need you to do something for me, she said, and you're not going to like it. Try me. Don't protect me too much, she said. If you smother the exercise with security, if you make it obvious, they'll just back off and wait for a better opportunity. And they'll have all the time in the world because they're patient and they're safe, and I'm the one who has to keep passing stations. If they back off tomorrow, they'll get me next week or next month at some station where you're not there to watch. Her jaw set. I don't want them to back off. I want them to try that tomorrow, where you and Reyes and Hale can see it. Because the only way I ever get to the truth about my father is if they make their move somewhere, I can catch it. Graves stared at her. You want to use yourself as bait. I want to end this, she said, on my terms, in the open, where it counts. She held his gaze. My father used to say, you don't wait for the enemy to pick the ground. You make the ground so appealing they can't resist it, and then you own it before they arrive. Tomorrow's ground is already chosen. I can't change that, so I'm going to own it. She paused. I need you to let them come, and I need you to trust that I've already seen most of what they're going to do. Just like I saw the tripwire, just like I counted the wind. For a long moment, Graves said nothing. Everything in him, 22 years of instinct, screamed to lock the exercise down to pull her out to protect the girl. But he looked at her and he saw that she wasn't asking as a frightened 17-year-old. She was asking as the daughter of Elias Vance, an operator in her own right, someone who'd thought this through more clearly than he had. Okay, he said finally, but I'm setting terms. Reyes and Hale and I will be positioned where we can move fast. You will wear a comm the whole time. And the second I think it's gone past catching them into actually killing you, I'm pulling the plug, and I don't care what it costs us. Are we clear? Clear, Aravance said, and then softer. Thank you, Master Chief, for believing me enough to let me do this. Don't thank me yet, Graves said grimly. Thank me when you're still breathing tomorrow night. That evening, Aravance did something she hadn't done since arriving. She went to find Commander Hale alone, and she asked him to tell her about her father. Not the mission, not the classified parts, just the man. Hale sat with her in the dark outside the barracks for a long time, and he told her things she'd never known. He told her that Elias Vance had once carried a wounded man 9 miles across enemy ground and refused to put him down even when his own legs gave out. He told her that Elias used to write letters to the families of every man he served with just in case, so that if he was the one who made it home, he'd have something to give them. He told her that Elias talked about his daughter constantly, that the whole team knew about the little girl in the high country who could read a man's whole life off his face, that Elias used to say she was going to be better than all of them put together. He was so proud of you, Hale said. You have no idea. Every letter home, every phone call, it was about you, what you'd learned, what you'd seen. He used to say, my Aravan sees the world the way it actually is, not the way people pretend it is. Hale's voice thickened. When we lost him, I couldn't look at his file. Any of us who knew what really happened, because we knew and we couldn't prove it and we couldn't do anything, and that's the worst feeling a man can carry. He turned to her. And then 2 years ago, I saw a report about a junior marksman shattering records, and I saw the name and I thought, my God, she's coming. Elias's girl is coming, and she's going to finish what we couldn't. Aravance was quiet and in the dark. Hale couldn't tell if she was crying. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. He never told me he wrote letters to the families, she said. But when he died, a package came to our house, handwritten, for my mother and me. It was the last thing he ever wrote. She paused. He knew, didn't he? He knew the mission was wrong before he went. That's why he wrote it. Hale closed his eyes. I think he suspected. I think he had a feeling. But he went anyway because that's the job, and because if he refused, they'd have just sent someone else, and he'd have been sending men to die in his place. He looked at her. Your father wasn't a fool, Aravance. If he walked into that kill box, it's because he saw no honest way out that didn't cost more lives. He made the choice that cost only his own team instead of somebody else's. That was Elias, to the end. Aravance sat with that, and then she said the thing that had been living under everything, the thing that had driven 3 years of training, the thing she'd never said out loud to anyone. In his last letter, she said quietly, he wrote something to me. He wrote, Aravance, if something happens, don't let them tell you it was random. Nothing about my life was random, and don't let them make you angry, because angry people miss the shot. He wrote, be still, be patient, count the wind, and wait for the honest window. He wrote it like he was talking about shooting. She turned to Hale. But he wasn't talking about shooting. He was talking about this, about the truth. He was telling me it would take years and I'd have to be patient, and I couldn't let the anger make me rush it. He was telling me how to get to the truth about his own death. Her voice finally broke just barely. He knew I'd come looking, and he left me instructions on how to survive the looking. Hale couldn't speak. He reached out and put a hand on her shoulder, and the two of them sat in the desert dark, the old operator and the young one carrying the same man's memory between them. The morning of the combined assault exercise, everything was calm on the surface and coiled underneath. Graves had done exactly as Aravance asked. He hadn't locked it down. He'd run it as a normal high-stress live fire station with the unit and the observers and the range staff all in their expected positions. But underneath, he and Reyes and Hale were watching everything, and Aravance wore a comm in her ear, and every man who knew the truth was ready to move. What none of them knew was exactly how the move would come. That was the part that had kept Graves up all night. An accident could be anything. A weapon malfunction, a mislabeled live round in a training weapon, a range safety officer who wasn't who he said he was. They were watching for a threat that could wear 1,000 faces. Aravance knew it too. And as she moved to her position at the start of the exercise, she did what she always did. She read the range. She read every face, every posture, every man who was where he was supposed to be, and more importantly, every man who wasn't. And that was how she saw him. There was a range safety officer positioned at the far edge of the exercise near the ammunition staging area, and he was wrong. Aravance knew it in the first 2 seconds, the way she'd known the tripwire, the way she'd known the wind. He was wrong in a dozen small ways that added up to one large certainty. His uniform was correct, but his boots were too new. He stood the way a man stands when he's trying to look relaxed instead of actually being relaxed. And most of all, he kept glancing at her. Not the casual glance of a safety officer keeping track of shooters, the repeated hungry checking glance of a man watching a target. She keyed her comm low so only Graves and Reyes and Hale could hear. Range safety officer far edge by the ammunition staging, she said calmly as if she were calling a distance on the sniper range. New boots, Wrong posture. He keeps checking me. That's him. That's the one. In the observation position, Graves went rigid. He found the man Aravance had described, and the second he really looked at him, he saw it too. All of it, everything she'd read in 2 seconds. Reyes, Graves said quietly into his own calm. You see him, Mayon. I see him, Reyes said. And Jonas, he's standing right next to the ammunition Vance is about to be issued for the live fire portion. He's got access to her rounds. The pieces snapped together with sickening clarity. The plan wasn't a stray bullet or a garbled order. The plan was simpler and far more deniable. They were going to put a bad round in her weapon, an overloaded cartridge or a barrel obstruction, something that would cause a catastrophic failure when she fired something that would turn her own rifle into the thing that killed her. And afterward, everyone would shake their heads and call it a tragic equipment malfunction. And the file on Elias Vance would stay sealed forever. And the men who'd murdered him would murder his daughter with a piece of defective brass and never be touched. Do not issue her that ammunition, Graves said into the comm, his voice like iron. Do not let her load that weapon. Reyes Hale moved beyond the safety officer. Now, quiet and fast. But Aravance's voice came back over the comm, calm and certain, and it stopped all 3 men cold. No, she said, don't move on him yet. Vance. If you grab him now, you've got a man in a stolen uniform standing near some ammunition, she said. That's nothing. That's a security breach. He'll claim he got lost, he'll lawyer up, and the people who sent him will disappear back into the dark and try again in 6 months when none of you are watching. Her voice never wavered. I don't want the errand boy. I want proof. I want him to actually do it. I want him to plant the round where you can all see him do it on the record, with witnesses, so that when I pull it out of my weapon, and it's the thing that was supposed to kill me, there's no explaining it away. She paused. Let him tamper with the ammunition. I'm not going to fire it. I already know it's coming. I'll pull the round before I ever chamber it. But I need him to plant it first. I need him to commit the crime where you can prove it. In the observation post, Graves and Hale looked at each other. It was insane. It was brilliant. It was exactly the kind of patience her father had written to her about. Be still. Be patient. Wait for the honest window. That's a hell of a risk, Graves said into the comm. If you misjudge which round he's tampered with, I won't, Aravance said simply. I've been watching his hand since I called him out. I'll know exactly which round he touches. I've spent 3 years learning to see the one thing everyone else misses. Her voice softened just slightly. Trust me, Master Chief, just like I trusted you to let them come. There was a long silence on the comm, and then Graves said the thing that 8 days ago he could never have imagined saying to the girl from Washington. Copy, he said. We'll follow your lead, Vance. It's your ground. Own it. And out at the far edge of the range, the man in the new boots and the stolen uniform bent over the ammunition staging area and glanced one more time at the small, quiet girl who was watching him with the calm, patient eyes of someone who had already seen exactly how this was going to end. The man in the stolen uniform worked fast, but not fast enough to escape the eyes that were already on him. Aravance watched his hands the way she'd watched 1,000 things in her life, the way her father had taught her on a hillside when she was 8 years old, and she saw the small, deliberate motion the swap one cartridge exchanged for another in the tray that would be issued to her. To anyone else, it looked like a range safety officer inspecting rounds. To her, it looked like exactly what it was. He did it, she said quietly into the comm. 3rd tray, 2nd row from the left. He swapped the 4th round from the end. That's the one. Her voice was perfectly even the same voice she'd used to call distances on the sniper range, the same voice she'd used to call the tripwire in the kill house. Are you getting this? Do you all see it? We see it, Graves said, and there was something dangerous in his voice now, the sound of a man who had made a decision he would never walk back. Reyes has eyes on it. Hale's recording. Keep going. Let him think it worked. So Aravance walked to the ammunition staging area, and she looked the man in the stolen uniform directly in the eye, and she smiled at him. It was a small smile, polite, the smile of a young candidate thanking a range officer for doing his job. And the man smiled back, and there was relief in it, the loose, easy relief of someone who believes the hard part of his day is behind him. He had no idea he had just smiled at the last person on earth he should have underestimated. She took the tray. She carried it to her firing position with the unhurried competence of someone who had handled 10,000 rounds. And every man who knew the truth held his breath, because now came the part that mattered, the part where a 17-year-old girl had to be exactly as good as she had claimed to be. Because if she was wrong about which round was the killing round, if her eyes had lied to her even once she was going to chamber it, and the desert would take far more than a single shot from her. Aravance knelt at her position. She began the loading process calm and methodical, and she counted the rounds as they went into the magazine. 1, 2, 3. The way she counted everything, and when she reached the fourth round from the end, the one the man had swapped, she stopped. She held it up to the light. To anyone watching from a distance, it was an ordinary inspection, a candidate being careful. But she was looking at the crimp, at the seating of the bullet, at the faint discoloration around the case mouth that told her this cartridge had been opened and repacked. Overloaded, packed with far more powder than any training round should ever hold, engineered to build pressure faster than the weapon could survive. Fire this round and the rifle would come apart in her hands, and the metal would go where metal goes when it has nowhere else to travel. Into the person holding it. Confirmed, she said softly into the comm. It's overloaded, repacked. If I'd fired this, the weapon would have detonated. This is the round that was supposed to kill me. She set it aside, separate from the others, lay gently on the mat where it could be seen and recovered, and tested evidence now instead of a weapon. It's out. I'm safe. And now you have him. For 1 second, the whole range held its breath. And then Master Chief Jonas Graves stood up from the observation post, and he was not the man who had spat on the ground in front of her boots 8 days ago. He was something older and harder, and absolutely certain, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the entire range like a rifle report. Stand down. All shooters, weapons, safe weapons down right now. Men froze all across the range, hands going still on their rifles. Reyes, Hale, take him. The man in the stolen uniform understood in a single instant that everything had gone wrong. He spun toward the ammunition area, toward Aravance's position, and his hand dropped toward his waistband where a real weapon was hidden beneath the fake uniform. Because his orders had a backup. Men like him always had a backup. And if the ammunition failed, then he would simply do it the old way and take his chances running across open desert. But he never cleared the weapon. Because Aravance had already moved. She had seen his hand drop before he had even finished forming the thought. Read the intention in the shift of his shoulder half a second before his fingers twitched. She was 17 and small, and 120 pounds soaking wet, and she crossed the distance between them. Faster than a grown man could react, because she was not trying to cover ground, she was trying to reach a place she had already calculated. She did not try to overpower him because she knew she could not. Instead, she did the thing her father had drilled into her a lifetime ago. The thing that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with seeing. She got inside the arc of his draw, trapped his wrist against his own body so he could not clear the barrel, and used his own panicked momentum against him. And by the time Reyes and Hale reached them, she was kneeling on his back with his arm locked at an angle that promised to break, and his hidden pistol was spinning away uselessly across the sand. The whole thing took 4 seconds. The range was dead silent. Every SEAL who had spent 8 days slowly, grudgingly learning who this girl actually was, had just watched her read a professional's draw across 5 meters and put him face down in the dirt before any of them could take 3 steps. Reyes got the cuffs on him, hauling his wrists together while the man cursed into the sand. Hale stood over the whole thing with the recorder still running, breathing hard, staring down at the man who had been sent to murder Elias Vance's daughter with a piece of tampered brass and a smile. "Who sent you?" Hale demanded. The man laughed, ugly and thin, his cheek pressed against the ground. "You think I know. You think they hand out names. I get a package and an address and half the money up front, the other half when it's done." He turned his head and his eyes crawled across the sand and found Aravance, who was standing now brushing the dust from her knees, calm as still water. "But I know one thing, little girl. You think you won today. You didn't. You just showed them exactly what you are. And there's more of me than there's ever going to be of you. This doesn't end. Not for you. Not ever. You'll be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life, however short that turns out to be." For a moment, nobody said anything. The threat hung in the desert air, and it was real, and everyone there knew it was real. Aravance looked down at the man for a long moment. And then she crouched, so her eyes were level with his, and she said something in a voice so quiet and so certain that every man on that range went cold to hear it. "You're wrong," she said. "It ends today, because you just made the mistake I have been waiting 3 years for someone to make." She tilted her head slightly. "You assumed I wanted to survive this evaluation. That was never the point. Passing the trial was never the point. Surviving was never even the point." She let that land, watching the confusion crawl across his face. "The point was to make them come for me somewhere I could catch them in the act. And you just did that. On the record. In front of a United States Navy commander, a master chief, and an entire SEAL unit." She straightened up. "I didn't need to know your name. You were never the target. You were the thread. And you just led me all the way back to the people holding the other end of you." Graves stared at her, and slowly, terribly, the full architecture of what she had done had assembled itself in his mind, and it took the breath right out of him. She had not come to this desert to pass a test. She had come here to be attacked. She had deliberately, methodically made herself into the single most visible, most undeniable, most impossible to ignore threat those men in the dark had ever faced, knowing they would not be able to resist trying to eliminate her. Knowing that the only way to expose people who operated in shadow was to force them to reach into the light where witnesses could see. She had used her own life as the honest window. She had waited through 3 years of gusting wind, and when the moment of calm finally came, she had fired into it without hesitation. "You planned this," Graves said, and his voice was not quite steady. "All of it. From before you ever set foot on this base. My father taught me you don't wait for the enemy to pick the ground," Erevan said. "You make the ground so appealing they can't resist it, and then you own it before they arrive. I couldn't reach the men who killed him. They were too deep, too protected, too patient. 3 years I looked for a way in, and there wasn't one, because you can't attack people who never show themselves." She looked down at the cuffed man. "So I stopped trying to find them. I made myself into the one thing they couldn't afford to leave alone. A living witness with a reason to open a sealed file and the skill to force her way into a program that would give her the clearance to do it. I made myself a problem they had to solve." She looked back at Graves. "And they sent him. And now he's not an assassin anymore. Now he's evidence. And evidence unravels." Hale had gone very still, a man watching something he had waited 3 long years to see. "The recording," he said slowly, half to himself. "The tampered round, the concealed weapon he was carrying, his contract, wherever the money came from his handler." He looked up at her, and there was something almost like reverence in it. "This isn't a sealed mission anymore, Erevan. This is an active, attempted murder of a candidate on a federal military installation, witnessed by a commander and documented on the record. They can't seal this. They can't bury this the way they buried the last one. This one has to be investigated. And any investigation that pulls this thread, pulls all the way back to my father's mission," Erevan finished for him. "Because the same people who sealed his death 3 years ago are the people who sent this man today. And the moment investigators start asking the obvious question, the only question that matters, why would anyone want this girl dead, there is only one answer that makes any sense at all." Her voice never wavered. "Because of what I would find in that file, I didn't just catch an assassin, Commander. I forced open the door. They cannot keep the file sealed now. Not when someone tried to kill me to keep it that way. The cover-up just became the proof of the crime." For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind moved off the northwest ridge, the same wind she had learned to beat, and it stirred the sand and settled again. And then Master Chief Jonas Graves did something no one expected. He started to laugh. It was low and disbelieving, and he wiped a hand down his weathered face, and he looked at the 17-year-old girl standing calm and unbothered in the middle of a range where she had just outmaneuvered people who had been running from the truth for 3 years, people who had murdered 8 of the finest operators the country ever produced and walked free the whole time. 8 days ago, Graves said, "I told my men you'd cry yourself home in 72 hours. I told them you were a mistake from Washington, a political experiment, a liability waiting to get somebody killed." He shook his head slowly. "And you just walked into a trap set by professional killers, saw it coming from the first 2 seconds. You laid eyes on the man, refused to spring it early because you understood the strategy better than any of us used your own life as bait. disarmed the assassin with your bare hands, and in the process you forced open a sealed file that half the intelligence community couldn't touch. He looked at her, and something in his face had gone all the way past respect into something closer to awe. You weren't the one being tested, Vance. We were. Every one of us. From the second you stepped off that transport, you were testing whether the people around you could see clearly enough to be worth trusting. And most of us failed for a long time. But you kept working anyway. You kept working while we doubted you. Aravance looked at him, and for the first time since she had arrived in this desert, she allowed herself a real smile, small and tired and true. The smile of someone finally setting down a weight she had carried alone for 3 years. You didn't fail, Master Chief, she said. You changed your mind when the data changed. That's rarer than getting it right the first time. My father used to tell me that anybody can be right by accident. Anybody can guess correctly. But changing your mind because you looked honestly at what was actually in front of you, admitting out loud in front of your own men that you had been wrong, that takes a real man. She paused. You did that. In the kill house, when your whole team was down and you could have blamed me, and instead you told the truth. On the range when the data no longer fit your assumptions and you stopped writing. And just now when you decided to stand in front of whatever was coming for me, without knowing if it would cost you your career or your life. You didn't have to do any of that. You chose to. That's the whole thing. That's everything. Graves had to look away for a moment because a man his age and his rank did not get his eyes wet on a firing range in front of his unit, and he was very, very close to it. The man in the cuffs, sensing the moment slipping away from him, tried one last time. You're all fools, he spat. You think one recording brings down what took years to build. You think they don't have people everywhere. In the investigation you were so proud of. You've signed your own. That's enough, Reyes said and hauled him up to his feet. But something the man had said made Aravance turn, and she studied him for a moment with those steady eyes. And then she said something that stopped everyone. He's telling the truth about one thing, she said quietly. There will be people inside the investigation. There always are. The men who did this didn't survive 3 years by being careless. So the investigation can't be a normal one. She looked at Hale. Commander, how many people know what happened here today, right now, this minute? Hale counted. Everyone on this range, maybe 20 people all told. Then we move before their people inside can move, Aravance said. The evidence goes today. Not up the normal chain where someone can lose it or delay it. It goes to the one place they can't reach. You told me some of you were watching. Some of you who owed my father. Who's the highest ranking one of you? And can you get the evidence into his hands before nightfall? Hale stared at her for a moment, and then a slow understanding dawned in his eyes, and behind it something like the ghost of an old grief lifting. Admiral Cortland, he said, he commanded your father's unit before he got his star. He tried to open the file himself 2 years ago. They shut him down, but they couldn't touch him. He's too senior, too clean, too visible. He nodded slowly. If I put this in his hands tonight, personally, there is no one on this earth who can make it disappear. Then that's the shot, Aravance said. Take it before the wind builds again. And Hale, who had spent 3 years feeling like a man who owed a debt he could never pay, looked at the daughter of the man he had failed to save, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt like maybe, just maybe, the debt could finally be paid. Yes, he said. God, yes, I'll be in the air within the hour. He was. In the weeks that followed, the thread Aravance had pulled did exactly what she had known it would do. It unraveled, and it unraveled fast because she had made certain it started in the one pair of hands that could not be pried loose. The man in the stolen uniform, facing the rest of his natural life in a federal prison, found his tongue. He gave up the intermediary who had hired him a name, a payment, a phone. The intermediary, facing the same fate, gave up more. And the recording from the range, the tampered, round, tested, and confirmed in a laboratory, the concealed weapon, the attempted murder of the decorated daughter of a decorated master sergeant on federal soil, made it impossible for anyone to make the story quietly vanish the way the last one had vanished. Too many people were watching now. Too many people in too many offices asked the one question that had no innocent answer. Why would anyone want this girl dead? The answer led exactly where Aravance had always known it would lead. To a mission 3 years old. To intelligence that had been manufactured, not mistaken. To 8 of the finest operators the country ever produced, sent into a kill box on purpose. to bury someone else's crime beneath their bodies. And to the men who had done it, men who had worn the same uniform Elias Vance wore, men who had walked free for 3 years sleeping easy, believing the file would stay sealed forever, believing that the dead stay silent and the grieving stay powerless. The file did not stay sealed, and the grieving, it turned out, had not stayed powerless at all. They came for the guilty one after another. Some of them still wore the uniform when the investigators arrived. Some of them had retired to comfortable lives built on the silence of 8 dead men. It did not matter. The thread had been pulled, and it pulled them all in, and there was nothing any of them could do to stop it, because the girl who had started it had made sure the first hands to hold the evidence were the only hands strong enough to keep it. Ira Vance was not there for most of it. She did not need to be. She had counted the wind and fired into the window, and now she simply waited the way her father had taught her to wait, while the round crossed the distance and found its mark. But there was one room she had to be in, one room she had trained 3 years and crossed a desert and offered up her own life to reach. She sat in a secure facility with Commander Hale on the day the file was finally formally opened to her, the whole of it, every page, every transmission, every truth that a 14-year-old girl had sworn at a graveside she would one day know. She read it all. She read what really happened on the hillside where her father died. She read the orders that should never have been given, the intelligence that had been invented, the names of the men who had signed the papers that sent 8 sons and fathers and husbands to their deaths to cover a mistake that was never theirs. And when she was done, she closed the file and she sat for a long moment in complete silence. And Hale, who had known Elias Vance and loved him and failed to save him, did not dare to speak. "Are you all right?" he asked finally gently. Ira Vance nodded slowly. He knew, she said. At the end, he knew what they had done to him. He understood it out there in his last minutes. She paused, gathering herself. In his last transmission, the very last thing he said on the radio before she stopped, steadied, started again. It wasn't a call for help. It wasn't a curse at the people who sent him to die. The techs who recovered the audio never understood it. They logged it in the file as delirium, incoherent. They wrote unintelligible in the margin and moved on. She looked at Hale and her eyes were wet now, but her voice was iron with steel, was everything her father had built into her. It was 5 words. He said, "Count the wind, Ira Vance. Wait." Hale's breath caught in his chest. He wasn't delirious, she said, and now the words came in a rush, 3 years of them. He was talking to me across everything, across the whole world and the end of his own life. He was talking to his daughter because he knew that someday I would find this file, that someday I would sit in a room like this and read these pages, that someday I would hear his voice again. And he used his last breath, his very last breath on this earth, not to save himself, not to curse his killers, but to give me instructions. Her voice finally broke all the way through and the tears came and she let them. He told me to be patient, to count the wind, to wait for the honest window and not to let the anger make me rush the shot. His last words were a message to me on how to survive getting to exactly this room, to exactly this truth. He knew I'd come looking, and he loved me enough in the last seconds of his life to leave me the map. Hale could not speak. He reached across the table and took the girl's hand in both of his, this old operator who had carried a debt for 3 years, and he held it while she cried, and he understood that Elias Vance's last words had reached across 3 years and 1,000 miles of desert and death itself and landed exactly precisely where he had aimed them. In the hand of his daughter at the moment she finally knew, "He would be so proud of you." Hale managed at last, his own voice thick. "Ira Vance. He would be so proud he couldn't stand it." "I know," she said softly and wiped her eyes, and something in her settled, something that had been unsettled for 3 years. "For the first time, I know." The men who had sent Elias Vance to die did not walk free anymore. The investigation Ira Vance had forced open swept them up one after another, and the story that had been buried for 3 years became the story everyone knew told, on the record proven beyond any doubt. And 8 families who had been told their sons and husbands and fathers died in a random and unavoidable tragedy learned at last that it had never been random at all, that their men had been betrayed by their own, and that a 17-year-old girl, the daughter of one of the fallen, had refused to let the lie stand over their graves. Some of those families wrote to her. She answered every letter. She had learned that from her father too, though she had only just found out. She finished the evaluation. Of course she finished it. With the assassin's plot exposed and the file torn open, and the guilty men falling one by one, there was no one left with the power or the nerve to stop her, and no one who would have dared to try. She qualified. She became part of the program, the youngest person ever to do so, though the program itself was a changed thing, now cleaned of the men who had corrupted it, rebuilt by the men who remain. Men who had stood on a firing range and watched a girl teach them what it actually meant to see clearly. But before she left the desert base for good, she did one last thing. She found Master Chief Jonas Graves at the sniper range at dawn, the same range where she had shot the first perfect run in 14 years, and she stood beside him and looked out at the distances and the flags and the lying wind off the northwest ridge that she had learned at last to beat. "I wanted to say goodbye," she said, "and thank you for letting them come, for standing in front of me when you didn't have to, for changing your mind." Graves was quiet for a moment, watching the light come up over the ridge. Then he said, "Can I ask you something I've been chewing on since the first day?" "Of course." "That first morning, on the tarmac, when I spat on the ground in front of your boots and told everybody standing there that you'd cry yourself home in 3 days. He turned to look at her, and there was something raw in his face, an old man's willingness to be answered honestly. "You didn't argue. You didn't get angry. You didn't even flinch. You just stood there and looked at me with those eyes. And I have spent 8 days trying to figure out what was going on behind them in that moment. So I'm asking you straight, what were you thinking when I did that to you?" Aravance was quiet for a long moment, watching the wind move the flags down the range building and gusting and settling the way it always did. "I was thinking about my father," she said finally. "He told me something once on the hillside when I was young. He said the people who underestimate you are giving you a gift, and most people are too proud to accept it. He said when a man looks at you and decides you're nothing, he's showing you the exact shape of his blindness. He's telling you precisely where he won't be looking, precisely how you can move through his world without him ever seeing you coming." She looked at Graves. "He told me the worst thing that can ever happen to you is to be taken seriously by your enemy. Because the moment they take you seriously, they start watching you. And once they're watching, everything gets harder." She turned back to the range. "So when you spat on the ground, Master Chief, and called me a mistake in front of all your men, you weren't insulting me. Not really. You were telling me that you would never ever see me coming." A small smile touched her mouth. "And that is the single most valuable thing one person can ever tell another. You handed me the whole board in 4 seconds. Every man's assumptions, every man's blind spot laid out in front of me like a map. After that, all I had to do was play it." She glanced at him. "So no, I wasn't angry with you. I was grateful. I've been grateful since the tarmac. I just couldn't tell you why until now." Graves stared at her, and then he let out a long, slow breath, and he shook his head and he laughed softly, a laugh with no bitterness in it at all, only the pure, clean recognition of a man seeing exactly how wrong he had been and exactly how much he had learned from being wrong. "Your father," he said, "was the finest sniper the team's ever produced. Every man who ever served knows his name, and now they'll know it for the right reasons because of you." He paused. "And I need you to hear something. Aravance Vance and I need you to believe it because I've never said it to another soul in 22 years. I have trained legends. I have stood on this range and watched men do things that don't seem humanly possible. And I have never, not once in all those years, seen anyone see the way you see. Not your father, not anybody who ever lived. You don't just watch the world. You watch it 3 moves ahead of everyone else in it." He came to attention, and he saluted her, and this time there was not a flicker of hesitation in it, not a trace of the man who had turned his back on her on the tarmac. "You are going to be the finest operator this country has ever put into the field," Graves said. "And every single time I train a young recruit from now until the day they retire me, I am going to tell them about the 17-year-old girl who walked onto my base, let a whole unit call her a mistake, and then taught an old Master Chief how to see. That's a promise. That's the last promise I've got, and it's yours." Aravance returned the salute crisp and true. And then because she was 17 years old and because for the first time in 3 years the weight she had carried alone had finally been set down, she did something she almost never did with anyone. She stepped forward and hugged him. Quick and fierce, the way you hold on to someone who was on your side when it counted for everything. "Take care of yourself, Master Chief," she said into his shoulder. You too, kid, Graves said, and his voice was rough as gravel, and he did not care anymore who saw his eyes. You take care of yourself out there. You hear me? She pulled back and nodded, and she walked toward the transport that would carry her out of the desert. Past Reyes, who nodded to her the way one deeply careful person nods to another they have come to respect above all others, a whole conversation in a single tilt of the head. Past Callahan, who had told her on the first day it would be easier for everyone if she just went home, and who now stood at rigid attention as she passed his jaw tight with something he was too proud to say out loud. Past Torres, who had walked into the tripwire and lived because she had seen it, and Doyle, who had once refused to even look at her and now could not look away. And past Kowalski, the harshest critic of them all, the man who had dropped back on that first brutal run to grin in her face and tell her she'd be screaming for a medevac. "Hey, Vance," Kowalski called out. She turned. He didn't grin this time. He just looked at her, this big sunburned man who had been so certain, so loud, so wrong. "Your old man," he said, and his voice cracked slightly. "Your old man would be proud of you. Prouder than any father's ever been of anybody. I just wanted to make sure somebody said it to your face before you left." Eravans held his eyes for a moment. "He knows," she said quietly. "For the first time, I really believe he knows." And she smiled at all of them, these men who had called her a child and a mistake and a liability. These men who had learned one by one, brick by brick, exactly how wrong they had been and who would carry the lesson of her for the rest of their lives. She climbed aboard the transport, and as it lifted off and carried her up and away from the base where she had rewritten 14 years of records and forced open a 3-year-old grave and caught the men who had put her father in it, Eravans Vance looked out one last time at the desert below, at the ridge, at the wind, at the long, punishing distances she had learned to master. And she thought about a hillside in the high country a long time ago, and a man with patient hands teaching an 8-year-old girl how to be still, how to empty the noise, how to wait, count the wind he had told her that day and every day and with his very last breath. Wait for the honest window. She had counted it. She had waited through 3 years of gusting grief and lying calm. And when the honest window finally came wide open and only there for a heartbeat, she had not flinched and she had not rushed. And she had not missed. In the desert, talent is not the thing that survives. Control is. And the quietest person in the room is almost always the one who has already seen the ending long before anyone else understands the story has even begun. They called her just a teen sniper. They were wrong about that, the way they had been wrong about everything from the very first second on the tarmac. Eravans Vance did not simply pass the trial they built to break her. She turned that trial into the instrument of her father's justice, and when the desert was finally done testing her, it was the desert that had been found wanting and the men who ran it who had been measured and found small. She was never the one being evaluated. She was the standard against which all of them would forever be judged. And every man who ever doubted her spent the rest of his life telling the story of the day the quiet girl proved exactly who she was. She did not just rewrite the evaluation. She became the reason it would never be the same again.